Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Whip Union, and in this one we have several developments across the eastern section of the front line, where the Russians continue expanding their bridgehead across the Usk River line in the northeastern section of the front line near Kupiansk. The Russians also expand their bridgehead across the Serbis River line to the north of Liman. The Ukrainians managed to stabilize the situation near Soledar, where they've managed to kick the Russians out of a foothold they managed to gain in a town in the northwestern parts of Bakhmut. The Russians expand their control over Toretsk, kicking the Ukrainians out of the city, and the Russians continued offensive operations both to the east and to the west of Pokrovsk, where they managed to improve their positions within the towns of Lysivka, Solone, and Uspenivka. The Russians also managed to improve their positions north of Andreevka, west of Korokhove, in the southeastern parts of the front line. Starting out in the southeast, the Russians have improved their positions north of Andreevka as they continue to close the positions of the Ukrainians in between the Russian forces to the north and to the south. This is to improve the northern flank of Andreevka, to gain control over the fortified positions and the high ground located in between Andreevka and Bogdanivka, and then to flank the fortified positions of the Ukrainians from the high ground and through the weak point from the rear, gain control over fortified positions near Oleksivka, Zeleny Kut, as well as Novokrainka, gaining control over the highway here between Andreevka and Dashne to improve the positions here in the southwestern parts of the Donetsk region. The Russians are also here looking to gain control over the forest lines and fields to allow for a wider buffer zone between the Russian supply line, which is the main highway between Andreevka and Pokrovsk, allowing for better coordination between the forces in the south and the north. This is especially important for the Russian forces once they reach the border area, as the Russians will then need to storm the town of Novopavlivka, which is the main supply hub for any of the Russian operations going into the Dnipropetrovsk region or the Ukrainian operations into the Donetsk region. This is an important border town which would allow the Russians to start operations within the next region. Based on this, we see that the Russians would need to coordinate their forces from the east, that is located along these towns in between the main roads to the north, west of Pokrovsk, or to the south, west of Korokhove. Securing both of these flanks will allow the Russians to pincer the town itself and to attack the supply lines of the town from the northern and southern flanks. It will also allow the Russians to bypass the Ukrainian positions in the southwestern parts of the Donetsk region. Also allow the Russians to improve their positions to the southern flank of the west of Pokrovsk, where they'll be able to secure the flank for better offensive operations towards the highway, further securing their positions alongside it to cut off the Ukrainian connection between Pokrovsk and the Dnipropetrovsk region. It will also be necessary for Russians to improve their positions along the border area for further offensive operations further north to cut off the road between Pokrovsk and the city of Dnipro itself. Therefore, we see that the expansion of Russian offensive operations alongside the Dnipropetrovsk border area is actually a reaction to the continuous Ukrainian counterattacks taking place on the western, northern, and eastern flanks of the Russian western flanking maneuver towards the city of Pokrovsk, where the Ukrainians have been attempting to regain control over Shevchenko, Pishane, Kotline, Udashne, and Uspenivka, as well as Solone. However, the Ukrainians have failed to gain control over any of these towns except for Udashne and Kotline, where Russians are pushed to the outskirts of Kotline and completely pushed out of Udashne. However, the Russians have managed to secure both the towns of Solone and Uspenivka, gaining full control over both of those. This allows the Russians to push further westwards towards Novolexandrivka, where the Russians have already reached the outskirts of the town. The Ukrainians attempted a counterattack to regain control over Uspenivka, where fighting has taken place over multiple months, which has now ended with a Russian victory. The Ukrainians then attempted a push towards Solone, almost gaining full control over the town. However, they failed to gain control over the fortified position of the Russians to the north of Solone. This puts the Ukrainians in a difficult position as the Russians had positions to the south and to the north of this push, cutting off the supply lines with direct fire control of the Ukrainian supply lines, and this eliminated the Ukrainian forces that were pushing into Solone, re-securing the town for the Russian forces. The Russians have now both secured the eastern and western flanks. However, this required a lot of the supplies and reinforcements of the Russian forces to be sent to both flanks, and this allowed the Ukrainians to gain further advantages in the northern flank, which has allowed them to push into Kotline and to push the Russians out of Udashne. Now that the Russians have secured both Solone and Uspenivka, we can expect further offensive operations by the Russians in the direction of Novoalexandrivka as well as Novoserhivka. The Russians will here attempt to reach the border area between the Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk region, and we'll also see further offensive operations in the direction of Udashne as well as Kotline, resecuring the town of Kotline and pushing into Udashne. The objective would be to secure the northwestern flank as well as the western flank of further offensive operations towards the coal mine situated west of Pokrovsk. This is a main defensive hub of the Ukrainians, as an industrial zone is well fortified and can last against artillery and FAB bombs, which the Russians are using to prepare for any assault. At the same time, it will also allow the Russians to secure the eastern flank further, as they do not need to approach the city yet before they secure the supply lines in and out of the town. Therefore, the main focus of the Russians will be to play defensive on the eastern flank, where we see that they've been able to secure both Shevchenko and Pishane, while they will launch offensive operations on the western and northern flanks to improve their positions in these directions. We also see, with the continued push towards Kotlyarivka, Toretsk, Orkhove, the fighting over Bohdanivka, as well as north of Andrivka, the Russians are here expanding their western flank for further offensive operations in the northern direction to not have too risky of a position. If the Ukrainians manage to capture Pishane or Shevchenko in the east and Solone in the west, they'll be able to cut off the Russian forces, but it would not be a significant concentration of them. If the Russians went deeper in the northern direction, additional forces would be encircled and it would be more risky for the Russians to launch such operations. Therefore, the Russians are going the safe way, and that is to secure the western flank before advancing further northwards. The Ukrainians do not have a large concentration of towns here west of Pokrovsk within the Donetsk side of the border area. The Russians gain control over Kotline, Udashne, Molodetsk, and Serhivka. They will gain control over all of the towns to the west of Pokrovsk, so these number only 4. In comparison, the Ukrainians have several towns and villages on the Dnipropetrovsk side of the border area, centered around the towns of Meshova and Novopavlivka, which are the main supply hubs for the Ukrainian forces across the border area, and those will be the 2 main targets of the Russian forces. And we can see, based on this, that Novopavlivka is further isolated. The Russians gain control over the towns along the main highway here to the south, as well as the towns along the river line to the north. Allow the Russians to launch a pincer maneuver towards this town, which is again fairly isolated from the rest of the villages and the towns within the Dnipropetrovsk border area. And then moving northwards towards Meshova would be along the main highway, and will have a secure flank to the west with a wide area between Novopavlivka and Ivanivka. And based on this, the safest and most useful town for the Russians to gain control of would be Novopavlivka, to secure a bridgehead across the Dnipropetrovsk region and to have a outpost and safe forward position for their forces to launch further offensive operations in the western flank of Pokrovsk in the northern direction to cut off the supply lines. To the east of Pokrovsk, the Russians managed to secure the eastern parts of Lysivka, securing the road between the eastern parts and the central parts, where they managed to enter the northern parts of Lysivka. The Ukrainians still have positions both within the southern parts of the town and the northern parts of the town, where they are secure from 3 separate directions, defending their positions within the town, and it is likely that the Ukrainians will launch additional counterattacks to secure their positions yet again. The fighting has not ended over neither Lysivka nor the towns of Solone and Uspenivka, as the Ukrainians continue their counterattacks to dislodge the Russian positions. The sooner the Ukrainians launch counterattacks following a Russian capture of a position, the more vulnerable it is. If the Russians are allowed to dig in, it is unlikely that they lose any of these positions, as we have seen with both Pishane and Shevchenko. Further east in the direction of Toretsk, the Russians have improved their positions in the northern parts of the city, where following capture of the industrial area of Krymske and the waste heap in the northern parts of the city, the Russians are now advancing both in the southern and western direction, where the objective is to cut the Ukrainians off from the apartment complex area and stadium area in the northern parts of the city, to push onwards towards the next waste heap in the western parts of the city, and then the final one in the northwestern outskirts of it, From this, we can see that the Russians would have full control over all of the waste heaps in the northern and western parts of the city, allowing them to secure the northern flank of it and to push onwards towards the fortified positions of the Ukrainians in the western and southwestern parts of it, fully securing the city. Therefore, we see that the main focus of the Russian forces currently is the northern flank. It will look to gain control over the waste heaps and the outskirts of the city to then push onwards towards the outskirts near the fortified positions in the western parts of the city, gaining full control of it, and then attacking Uspenivka from the eastern and southern flanks from multiple directions, as they already have control over the southern flank of the city. So we see that the Russians are currently improving their positions in the northern parts, and the Ukrainians have completely lost the initiative within the city itself. Instead, the Russians have the initiative and are pushing the Ukrainians back in the northern and southern parts of it. However, the Ukrainians have managed to secure multiple months of advances of the Russians, as well as securing the towns of Uspenivka and Novospassky, kicking the Russians out of them. We see that they've managed to gain a lot of success with these operations. The question here would be if they are able to take advantage of these reconquests and to establish proper defensive positions and dig in within these towns and positions that they have recaptured. In the direction of Vasyukivka to the north of Soledar, the Ukrainians have kicked the Russians out of the outskirts of the town where the Russians had managed to gain a foothold within it. The Ukrainians here have secured the town of Vasyukivka since the Russian capture of Soledar, but the Russians have been unable to advance in the western direction. Instead, they have managed to have some success in the northern and southwestern flanks. However, Vasyukivka has been a safe town since the Russian capture of Soledar, which took place 2 years ago. However, it has not been one of the primary axes for Russian offensive operations. Instead, that has been in the southern parts of the Donetsk region, as well as in the Kupiansk direction. In the direction of the Serbs River line, the Russians continue expanding their zone of control across the Serbs River line, securing their supply lines and continuing their offensive operations both in the direction of Borova to the northwest and Liman to the southwest. The Russians here continued offensive operations to gain full control over the fortified positions in the western flank, both in the direction of Nove as well as in the direction of Liman. And at the same time, they continued offensive operations along the eastern fortified line, where the objective is to move in the direction of Borova, but also to secure the river line itself. The Russians are here looking to expand the bridgehead across the Serbs river line for a larger concentration of forces, again to launch operations in the direction of Borova in the north and Liman to the south. The Russians are here starting to move into the towns such as Nova and Counterattacks, where the objective is to secure some residential areas for concentration of forces, and also to cut off the roads and supply lines of the Ukrainian forces between Borova and Liman, isolating both of these sections of the front line. The objective is to create another half pocket similar to the Kupiansk direction here near Borova, and a third one in the direction of Liman, isolating these three parts of the eastern bank of the Usk River line from each other. The objective is to concentrate their fire in smaller areas, where the Ukrainian forces would be forced to concentrate their forces in smaller areas, increasing the effectiveness of the Russian artillery and creating fire pockets. At the same time, these positions are all across the Usk River line, which means that all of these three positions would put strain on the Ukrainian supply lines across the river line, as they would have to have limited crossings, which the Russians constantly target, both with artillery and FAB bomb strikes, to hit the Ukrainian supply lines and damage it as much as possible. To the north of Kupiansk, the Russians continued offensive operations in the direction of the town of Kamyanka. They have managed to gain a foothold over a few days ago, and now they've managed to advance further within the eastern parts of the town. The Russians are here looking to gain full control of it, which will secure the road between Topoli and Kamyanka, advancing all the way down south towards the Vorishna, with a supply road going and connecting the Russian positions from Topoli near the border area all the way down south towards Kupiansk. At the same time, it will also allow the Russians to create a larger buffer area between the Usk River line and the positions across the river line, for them to have multiple crossings across a wider area and also to have a larger concentration of forces. The Russians are here looking to expand their bridgehead across the Usk River line with further offensive operations in the direction of Kupiansk to the south and Vovchansk to the northwest, both of which require a significant amount of forces across the Usk River line, and therefore wider crossings and wider bridgeheads are necessary for these larger concentrations of forces. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.